look at those with attack, percent, or crit substats that can offer relevant damage bonuses, while EM weapons should only be used in melt teams. 5-star weapons or the 4-star Wixis will be her general top options. Be mindful of the damage bonus type some weapons give. For instance, if they're buffing normal or charged attack damage, then you'll have to adapt your playstyle to take advantage of such buffs. Elemental damage bonuses will instead be more flexible in buffing all her damage sources. Finally, let's go over her major team comps and synergies. In a freeze team, Charlotte mainly provides good sustained cryo application while consolidating your survival needs. Freezing enemies before you use her hold skill can also help her avoid getting staggered from enemy attacks, making her feel a bit more comfortable to use. Freeze teams generally don't need very strong healing as well, since the enemies are ideally crowd controlled off enough that they won't be able to hit you as much, if at all. In such cases, you can skew her build more towards damage than healing. However, one major exception to this is if you're playing a freeze team with Furina, since Furina drains your entire team's HP for her buffs. In this case, you will want to build Charlotte for more healing, so she can better mitigate Furina's HP drain. Charlotte does feel like a very suitable teammate for Furina freeze teams, as she conveniently consolidates the role of cryo application over time and healing. Another template that makes good use of freeze are bloom-based reaction teams. This requires good Hydro and Dendro applicator teammates who will generate Dendro cores from enemies, while Charlotte's cryo application will consistently freeze them for crowd controlling and helping in core generation. While a pure Bloom team is possible, doing a Bloom team without Nilou isn't as great in terms of damage, and Charlotte can't work with Nilou's restriction. Instead, we can add an Electro or Pyro unit that can trigger Hyper Bloom or Virgin to help increase the team's damage potential. In general, Hyper Bloom is the better and easier route. Charlotte can be your on-field driver, and if you're also using Furina as a Hydro applicator, then Charlotte's healing will mitigate Furina's HP drain. For Virgin, Charlotte's cryo application also helps counteract potential Pyro or burning auras on enemies, which can then allow more consistent core generation. I think that Freeze and Fridge variants will be her ideal teams. Another team you could consider is Reverse Melt teams, where she could provide healing and a bit of off-field damage, or maybe you're actually using her as your on-field cryo DPS. To enable Pyro application, this is typically done with a Bennett Shuttling combo, a Sunfire combo, or a Burn combo with Nahida. However, with Bennett already a staple in most Reverse Melt teams, that can make Charlotte's healing quite redundant, and since she doesn't output great damage, I generally just recommend using another cryo DPS or support that can output more damage or buffs. But if you just want more comfort, then Bennett and Charlotte will give a lot of healing together, while getting her own melt numbers in. Forward melt teams are also a possibility, which involves a Pyro DPS with more controlled application like Deluge. Since Pyro gets rid of the cryo aura faster, you'll need multiple fast enough cryo sources so Pyro hits can melt consistently. In a mono cryo team, she can be your survival support, which frees up all other slots for offensive characters. If you have Shinra, her quill stacks will give Charlotte a huge but limited base damage buff. Charlotte can then frontload all the quill stacks by using her burst, which does very fast cryo hits, and since having 2 to 3 cryo teammates lowers her ER needs significantly, you also have more room to build offensive stats on her. As Very Niche mentions, she can also go in a big melt team to introduce some melts, assuming enemies are freezable, or a physical team where she can act as a superconduct trigger, assuming you don't have a cryo DPS or support doing that already. And that's the story of Charlotte. She's got a pretty basic support kit, but if healing and cryo application are what you're looking for, then she has you covered. For newer players who don't have a huge roster and are pulling on Furina's banner, it also feels like Charlotte's there to ensure that you have at least another healer other than Barbara to help add more team building options that can work with Furina's HP draining mechanics. Let me know in the comments what you think of her, and if this video helped you out, don't forget to leave a like, consider subscribing to my channel if you haven't already, and I will see you all soon. Take care!
is a public charity. It files for As per ProPublica's nonprofit explorer, Susan G. Komen, a public charity, makes 90% of its revenue from contributions, and over a third of its expenses go to executive compensation and salaries. The Gates Foundation, a private foundation, spends over 100% of its annual revenue on charitable disbursements. I've picked these two organizations to illustrate a very specific point. The tax law is extremely concerned about, number one, what your goals are as a charity, and number two, where your funds come from. But it is less concerned about how you meet your goals. Susan G. Komen is a public charity. Most of its funds come from contributions, but a large part of those contributions are spent paying their employees, and not being spent on, say, distributions to research organizations. That's not illegal in the slightest. It's not the government's job to tell Susan G. Komen how to do its job of raising awareness for breast cancer and / or funding breast cancer research. On the surface, Susan G. Komen seems like it's spending a lot of contributed money only to disperse very little of it for the purpose of research. But the good a charity does is not solely in the money it distributes. If Susan G. Komen raises awareness and generates funds that would otherwise not have existed, it is arguably a net positive. The degree to which it is a positive is hard to quantify. The state doesn't concern itself, for the most part, with the quantifying unless something fraudulent is happening, in which case we move outside of the purview of tax law and into the purview of criminal law. Jesus Christ, Mooney, how much more of this law stuff are we going to do? Look, I promise we're almost done. The rabbit hole is extremely deep here, 70,000 pages deep to be exact, so bear with me. We've almost put together the bare minimum we need to tackle this subject with any degree of nuance. Just be glad that I moved the criminal law stuff to the analysis section. In any case, a private foundation has more room to operate than a public charity, provided it follows some additional regulations, like the filing of a 990-PF. The additional regulations that a private foundation has to follow are determined in part by what category of private foundation they are. For tax purposes, there are three types of foundations. Number one, a private operating foundation. Number two, an exempt operating foundation. And number three, a private non-operating foundation. We won't get into the differences as it's outside the scope of the video. Just know that the rules can change depending on the kind of foundation you operate. Private foundations, as we know, have to file an annual Form 990-PF, but private foundations are also required to follow rules concerning prohibited transactions or risk being subject to an excise tax, which is like a tax penalty of sorts. If further violations occur, additional taxes or penalties might be levied. The prohibited transactions are as follows. A private foundation must not, number one, engage in self-dealing, number two, fail to distribute income for charitable purposes, number three, have excess business holdings, number four, make any jeopardizing investments, and number five, make any taxable expenditures. Of these five prohibited transactions, two are relevant to our case, self-dealing and failure to distribute income. Know what you're thinking, and no, having excess business holdings does not mean having tons of cash lying around. It means specifically that the foundation can't own more than 20% of the voting stock of a different corporation. In any case, self-dealing occurs when a private foundation conducts a transaction like providing goods or services or paying compensation to a disqualified person. Who counts as a disqualified person? Well, the answer is all substantial contributors to the foundation, all managers of the foundation, an owner of more than 20% of the foundation in a few circumstances, and a member of the family of any individuals described in 1, 2, or 3. In short, the foundation can't offer a good or service or pay certain people, including the owner of the foundation, the managers of the foundation, and their family members, without being subject to additional taxation. For failing to distribute income for charitable purposes, a private foundation other than an operating foundation is required to annually distribute 5% of the foundation's net investment. And a failure to do so will subject the foundation to an excise tax of 30% of any undistributed income, meaning if Open Hand is a private foundation, it must make at least 5% distributions pursuant to its income or risk being levied a heavy excise tax. But here's the thing. A public charity does not have this prohibited transaction requirement. Public charities generally have a lot more leeway than private foundations do. All 501c3s are presumed to be private foundations unless they affirmatively file to be categorized as a public charity. For the record, most 501c3s do exactly that right out of the gate. But a private foundation that has later filed to become a public charity, Senate petition granted by the IRS, might legally have to masquerade for a time as a private foundation whilst still being categorized as a public charity. Although public charities are less restricted in what they can do compared to private foundations, they are still subject to the overarching rule of 501c3s from earlier, which is that no part of the net earnings of the public charity may inure to the benefit of any private individual or shareholder, which is defined as a person having a personal and private interest in the activities of the organization, which is to say a public charity can't be organized for the financial benefit of yourself or your family. No part of the net earnings may inure or take effect to the benefit of yourself or your family. Inurement is a very wide net. An improper use of assets, for example, might warrant a penalty. A more serious inurement like embezzlement might be liability. But because the tax code is such a mess and so confusing, the IRS can be pretty forgiving when it comes to mere clerical errors, which is to say, poorly filed paperwork. You'll notice once again, just as before when we talked about the Gates Foundation and Susan G. Komen, the law cares very much about the goals of a charitable organization, which is to say what it operates for. And the law cares very much about the people running the charitable organization and how much money they're taking away from the charity's income. But especially for a public charity, how the organization goes about the act of fulfilling its goals are left more or less to the organization, with some exceptions, like when the act of fulfilling its goals crosses the line into taking away from the charity's income in the form of inurement. So that was a lot, and honestly a lot of it was paraphrased, and we've only just scratched the surface. American tax law is the single most convoluted body of law in the world, and I'm not a tax lawyer. But I think we've put together just enough context to understand what is going on. Now that you know what a 501c3 is, what the difference between public charities and private foundations are, and what the law expects of private foundations and public charities, we can finally look at the Open Hand Foundation and the allegations made by Carl Jobst and some ordinary gamers to see if anything unethical or illegal has occurred, as the law sees it. Congratulations, you survived the tax law portion of the video. If you thought to yourself, wow, that was long and tedious, don't blame me, blame Lex Torius. In any case, let's finally get to the allegations. I've gone through a few of Carl Jobst's videos on the topic, including the most recent response video, and put together a list of allegations. I've augmented that list with additional allegations made by Budahar over at Some Ordinary Gamers. We'll go over each allegation, weigh it against the completionist's apology video, and then determine whether the allegation is plausible, implausible, inconsequential, or trouble. What does trouble mean? Well, trouble is the kind of thing that I'd hypothetically advise a client to avoid saying if they don't want to be sued. Maybe by seeing where the invisible lines lie, you yourself might be able to avoid trouble when you make such similar statements. Starting with Jobst's claims in his very first video, he alleges the following.
Surprised to see me here.
Contributed a single cent to any organization. They raised $600,000, and it's sitting in their bank account. Jobst says, this is important because if a charity raises money, they are supposed to give it to an organization. He then points to the publicly available 9:90 p.m., which shows that the contributions have indeed been piling up and that no distributions have been made, despite Gerard's public claims that he has been working with a variety of charitable organizations. As an aside, Jobst also points out that the 9:90 p.m. hasn't been signed. As such, Jobst accuses Gerard and the Open Hand Foundation of, number 1, charity fraud, number 2, of lying about working with charities when no funds were distributed, and number 3, of unethical and almost certainly illegal behavior.
That being said, even if all of the money is still there, the actions of Open Hand were unethical and almost certainly illegal.
Let's call these allegations the original 3. Jobst then asked the allegations, stating that the funds from a fundraiser golf tournament run by the completionist's father, known as the Convenience Cup Challenge, which should be going to the Open Hand Foundation, are not accurately reflected in the foundation's
Let's finish this quickly.
tax returns. Jobst calls this misrepresentation, and Budahar specifically points out that this could be embezzlement. A surprise allegation is then made concerning Jamie Lee Curtis, who reported the Open Hand Foundation on her organization's tax returns as a public charity and not a private foundation. So far, we have been operating under the assumption that the Open Hand Foundation is a private foundation because it files a 990 The allegation here is that the money that Jamie Lee Curtis is contributing is being wrongly reported for one, and second, is not being accurately accounted for in Open Hand's tax return. To summarize, the first allegation here is that the income from the Convenience Cup Challenge is not being reported on the tax returns, which could be misrepresentation or embezzlement. The second allegation is that the Convenience Cup Challenge itself might be conducting some kind of fraudulent activity. It appears to be generating massive income for the Open Hand Foundation, which is not stated on the tax return.
Your coming was
The third allegation
foretold.
is that Jamie Lee Curtis's
Whirling
organization
snow.
is mistakenly identifying the Open Hand
We're the
Foundation's
eternal
being
oasis!
contributed has not been recorded on the Open Hand Foundation's tax return. We'll categorize these allegations as missing funds. Now, instead of going chronologically to the completionist's apology, we're going to skip ahead and see what the final list of Jobs' allegations looks like. In the response video's intro, Jobs outlines his final three allegations. Number 1, completion. On screen, Jobs states that the completionist committed charity fraud by making false, misleading statements about what the charity was doing in order to solicit donations. Number 2 is that the completionist stole money. Jobs says that the completionist stole donations that were supposed to go to the Open Hand Foundation. Allegation number 3 is that the golf charity money is missing. Here, Jobs says that the revenue generated by the golf tournament run by Gerard
Bloom as the flowers in Gurabad!
If we
Whirling
combine
snow.
this final list of the allegations made in prior videos, the fundamental allegations are, number 1, the completionist committed charity fraud by lying about what donations received by Open Hand were being used for. Number 2, the completionist stole some of the money Open Hand should have received, which is embezzlement. And
Speed of light!
there are funds that are still missing, presumed stolen, from the golf tournament. From
Let's
Jamie
light it up!
Curtis and more, as per the Open Hand Foundation's tax return. Now that we have our allegations, let's see what the defendant has to say. Does Gerard defend these claims? Well, Gerard's apology is very interesting, to say the least.
Let's
It's
light it
immediately
up!
apparent that lawyers were involved in this statement, and I gotta say, it's well put together. Jobs calls this apology the worst video he's ever seen. But he wouldn't say that if he was a lawyer and could read between the lines here. Consider the opening statement concerning charity fraud and more. It's a hit right at a weak spot in Jobs' argument, and it baits a very specific response, one which Jobs fell for hook, line, and sinker. But that's a topic for a future law review episode, I suspect. You can also consider the very precise language being used here in the formatting of the video, which looks a lot like how I format my videos, because all lawyers are taught to draft this way: issue, rule/context, argument, and conclusion. It looks like his attorneys also categorized the allegations similarly. The explanation proper begins with the completionist talking about donating his mother's body to research. It's meaningful, it's easy to sympathize with, but it has a secondary motive. The completionist, the individual, is telling you that he has contributed something of value to unnamed
Don't blink!
organizations. He then states that he considers his family's legacy efforts as part of the Foundation's history. This statement, though an emotional appeal on
going
its
in!
surface, also has potentially legal ramifications as a way of demonstrating the Open Hand Foundation and the completionist directly working with certain research organizations. Moving on, he states that the Open Hand Foundation started in 2014 as a private foundation. He then states that the Open Hand Foundation terminated its private foundation status and began operating as a public charity.
Let the wind lead.
With evidence showing that the conversion was, in fact, successful. He also confirmed that the foundation was still required to file formal indictment until the 60-month termination period concluded. He finishes this revelation by stating that
any possible issues pertaining to such filings can only be considered clerical errors and are in no way intended to be misleading, fraudulent, or criminal in any nature.
Remember what we said earlier about clerical errors in the IRS. Pay close attention to this word, intended. We'll see how that comes up later. Gerard then brings up Jobs' claim that the organization didn't sign its tax return before going into the subject of restricted and unrestricted donations. I don't think that this part of the video was very clear, so let me help clarify what he's talking about. Restricted donations are, as the name suggests, no strings attached donations. Spend it on whatever you like, including administrative costs or miscellaneous expenses. There's little to no accountability for the money once it gets donated. Blue Channel's donations to Doctors Without Borders, for example, are all unrestricted donations. Restricted donations, though, are dedicated to a purpose. For example, if you make a restricted donation of, I don't know, $600,000 to a charity, the donation is restricted only to
Much
research
remains
activities. The charity cannot then pull that money and spend it on employees' salaries. Here's the catch, though. When Gerard states that the bigger the donation is, the better, this is true. One might imagine that donating funds is just a matter of sending money, but that's not true. If you are donating permanently restricted funds, what you can do instead of just sending the money in one lump sum is you can set up an endowment fund, where the principal amount of money is either untouchable or is not fully
I swear by my sword.
Interest from the fund is useful. In this way, if you have a very large sum of principal delivered in the form of permanently restricted funds, you could potentially fund a charity in perpetuity. You know the old parable, give a man a fish and he's fed for a day, but teach a man to fish and he's fed for a month. That's what's going on. With a large enough income, the charity has not just for a life, but forever. However, this requires not only a large sum, but a complicated procedure to set up the endowment, one that requires lawyers, which requires time and money. In addition, one has to carefully vet candidates and then determine what to restrict funds for in order to maximize the fund's effects. Because
Let's
such
light it
a
up!
fund is powered by interest, naturally the larger a fund is, the larger the principal and the more effective it is in the long run. It is typical behavior, it is even, dare I say, expected behavior for a public charity which has the intention of distributing its funds in a restricted manner to hold on to the money until the fund is substantial enough to make a long-term difference. As long as an endowment is on the table, it doesn't even have to be being planned from the outset. But if an endowment is a consideration, holding onto the funds is not unusual. Moving on, here comes the first mention of the golf tournament. Revenue sources for the foundation include direct and indirect public support, the golf fundraiser revenue, and Indieland revenue. The foundation's expenses include
Don't blink.
costs for the golf fundraiser and Indieland,
Couldn't break
operational costs,
the
and
curse.
various fees, totaling $178,917 over the last 9 years.
Be still.
Let's see where this goes. Gerard lets us know that in 2023, the Tiltify campaign for Indieland raised approximately $64,350, he says, which turned into about $61,200. $15,000 in sponsorships is then added, which
Don't
gives
blink.
us a total number of around $76,300.
But the plan was water inside.
Gerard then states that there were costs from this event which come out to just under $12,000. Concerning Jobs' free tax auditing with regards to the golf tournament, Gerard acknowledges that they made a mistake in accounting. The money is all there, it's just bad math. He then describes how the golf tournament made less money moving forward due to COVID, and that the funds from the golf tournament didn't come in all at once, which caused some of the proceeds to roll over into the next year. And, he says, golf tournaments also have expenses. Gerard doesn't go into the specifics of this accusation with regards to, say, sponsored income from the golf tournament. On to the claims of embezzlement. Gerard defends these expenses by noting that the transition from private to public charity has expenses, and that the organization is legally allowed to use its proceeds to pay those expenses. And yeah, that's true. Lawyers can be expensive, as we all know. Gerard then discusses an allegation that I didn't bring up earlier, made by Mudahar concerning the 5% payout rule for private foundations. Gerard defends against
It
this
seems that
allegation
your
by stating
strategy
that
was
the
a cut
foundation
above.
is a public charity and has been since 2016. Gerard concludes by stating that not a dollar raised from Indieland was ever used on anything to personally benefit me or my family. This language is not meant to suggest that Gerard didn't benefit from the clout of running Indieland or anything like that. It's meant to defend against claims of inurement, which we've discussed a little bit, but we'll go into further detail in the analysis portion of this video. The video closes with Gerard chastising Jobston Mudahar before stating that he will not be painted as someone who is a con artist, that he will stand up to this situation, which is a not-so-subtle legal threat. Okay, so we finally have all of our allegations in a row, and we've reviewed the completionist's response. It's time to break down each allegation and weigh each one against the facts and the law. Let me preface this section by stating that prior to this drama, I had never watched a completionist or Jobst or Mudahar video, and that I don't have a horse in this race. What Jobst, Mudahar, and Gerard get up to is generally not my concern, but I do care a lot about charity work, which is why I want to weigh in. Outside of that, I maintain that I have no biases here. We'll start by reviewing our simplified allegations one last time. Number 1. The completionist committed charity fraud by lying about what donations received by Open Hand were being used for. Number 2. The completionist stole some of the money Open Hand should have received, which is embezzlement. And number 3. There are funds that are missing, presumed as stolen from the golf tournament, from Jamie Lee Curtis, and more, as per the Open Hand Foundation's tax returns. Starting now, finally, with allegation number 1. Let's analyze the claims and see whether this allegation is plausible, implausible, inconsequential, or trouble. We'll start by asking a simple question. If you are going to make a legal allegation pursuant to a legal term with legal consequences, where should you get your definitions from? Well, I'll tell you where you shouldn't get your definitions from. Jobst and Mudahar both pull their definition of charity fraud, which is their primary and most severe allegation, from LegalMatch.com, which is basically the lawyer's version of Christian Mingle. It helps prospective clients find lawyers. It's not a reliable legal resource. Jobst uses this definition. Charity fraud is when someone takes advantage of a charitable or non-profit organization for their own personal gain. But you see, this is not a legal definition. Open Hand is based in California. This is a legal definition. Any person who solicits or attempts to solicit or receives money or property of any kind for a charitable, religious, or eleemosynary purpose, and who directly or indirectly makes, utters, or delivers, either orally or in writing, an unqualified statement of fact concerning the purpose or organization for which the money or property is solicited or received, or concerning the cost and expense of solicitation or the manner in which the money or property or any part thereof is to be used, which statement is in fact false and was made, uttered, or delivered by that person either willfully and with knowledge of its falsity or negligently without due consideration of those facts, which by the use of ordinary care he or she should have known is guilty of a misdemeanor, and is punishable by imprisonment in the county jail for not more than 1 year by a fine not exceeding $5,000, or by both that imprisonment and fine. What's the difference here between definition 1 and definition 2 aside from the length and clarity? Well, definition 1, being a simplification, is unclear about what the terms takes advantage and personal gain mean, and definition 1 uses organization language when definition 2 uses purpose language. Alright, I can see your head spinning, so let me translate definition 2 into plain English while attempting to preserve its meaning. If you take money for charity reasons and you say something about what that charity is or does, how much it costs to reach out to get that money, or how that money is going to be used, and you can't back up what you said with facts, then you're guilty of a misdemeanor, as long as you know what you said is untrue or you acted irresponsibly when you really should have known the things you said were untrue. But Mooney, I can hear you say, that definition was exactly the same as the first one, right? This is just semantics. Well, if you think the distinctions are semantic, then respectfully, you aren't qualified to be calling this behavior certainly illegal. If charity fraud is merely taking advantage of a charitable organization for personal gain, then if Jobst is wrong in his accusations, he's committed charity fraud. Does that sound right to you? Let's take a look at what Gerard said together with regards to what Open Hand has done and where the money is going. He states that Open Hand has partnered with or worked with organizations, including the USF and the Alzheimer's Association. He states that
we're trying to help those who are affected by Alzheimer's, all types of dementia, and beyond. Specifically, people families who have just found out that a loved one has dementia, and the next steps that are taken to help them transition from the shock of it all to the next steps of getting in-house care and so much more.
And he states that Indieland's proceeds go towards charity. But we know from the tax returns that Open Hand's accumulated funds were not in fact being used anywhere at the time these statements were made. That said, these statements are not conclusive, direct evidence of wrongdoing. This is circumstantial evidence, and we can interpret these statements either charitably or uncharitably. Interpreted charitably, we see how Gerard's apology video comes into play. Now, if one considers the initial donation of his mother's body to science, and the interactions between his family and unnamed organizations, that there is some lineage of working together with whatever those organizations happened to be. Furthermore, of course, working with or even partnering with an organization doesn't necessarily imply funding it. Susan G. Komen is a public charity for breast cancer awareness, but their actual contributions to breast cancer research are somewhat limited. And that's okay. That's not only legal, but arguably, depending on one's perspectives, also ethical. It could be the case that Open Hand is working with USF or the Alzheimer's Association in ways that aren't necessarily reflected on the tax returns. And the times where Gerard has stated that funding has occurred might be obvious miscommunications or simple misstatements, human error that no reasonable person would take seriously. Of course, Open Hand isn't a primary funder of the University of San Francisco. Any reasonable person would see that this was a misstatement made by a very clearly nervous individual trying to do public speaking. If one interprets these statements uncharitably, though, then it looks like Gerard is obfuscating the truth of the matter, which is that the money going into Open Hand isn't being spent on what he says it is. This uncharitable position is the one Jobst takes from the get-go. If we take this uncharitable approach and then apply the facts to our legal definition, if Gerard did actually know that Open Hand was holding on to all of the money, or he should have known that this was the case, but he continued to say that he's worked with all of these charities and has donated money to help families, he is guilty of a misdemeanor. Here's the thing though, legal justice, unlike YouTube drama, has some rules of engagement, and a fundamental rule of justice is that people are innocent until proven guilty, and so I'm inclined to consider Gerard's statements charitably. Yet even if Gerard's statements are weighed charitably, even if one says, okay, I believe Open Hand has worked with the organizations it says it has and has contributed something, if not funds, to parents who are trying to figure out dementia, etc., then one could still make the argument that Gerard should have known that his statements may have been misleading. This is especially the case for the most recent Indieland event, at which time I believe Jobst had already conducted the interview with Gerard and made his intentions known. If Gerard was negligent in his statements under California law, that is still potentially charity fraud. Oh boy, okay, quick crash course. Negligent is also a legal term of art. It is one of the 4 states of mind that we collectively call mens rea. When you do something wrong, you either do it intentionally, knowledgeably, recklessly, or negligently. Let's say royalty-free Smug Dolphin here is standing on a ladder. If you went out of your way to kick the ladder down in order to harm the dolphin, you acted with intent or purpose. If you set up the ladder in such a way that you knew collapse was inevitable but didn't care, and the ladder collapses with the dolphin on it, you acted with knowledge. If you set up the ladder only halfway, leave, and then it collapses on the dolphin as it swims by, you might have acted recklessly. And if you set up the ladder in the middle of the street without warning signs and the dolphin bumps into it, causing the ladder to fall on the dolphin, you may have acted negligently. Gerard, even if the statements he made are considered charitably, has arguably uttered a false statement about Open Hand negligently, without due consideration of the facts which by use of ordinary care he should have known. This potential argument of negligence is corroborated by Gerard's statement that he didn't know that Open Hand had never donated the money. It could be argued that Gerard, as the primary fundraiser for Open Hand and as an officer of that organization, should have known that Open Hand hadn't made any monetary distributions and thus acted negligently when making his statements in line with him. Now, there is a lot of presumptions here, individual points of contention that could go either way and aren't nearly as open and shut as Jobst makes them out to be. That said, given what I've seen of Gerard's statements and of the law itself, I'm inclined to call this initial allegation of charity fraud plausible. But let me qualify that with a caveat. Though charity fraud is plausible here, plausible does not mean likely, and I am of the opinion that it is unlikely that any actual charity fraud has occurred. Why do I believe that? Well, just as the intentions of actions can change how culpable one is of a crime, the intentions of legislature can change the plain functions of a law. And it appears to me that the intention of 532D's wording is to target people like charity scamming phone solicitors, who aren't in the same box as Gerard, if Gerard's words are weighed charitably. This is as far as I can go, however, in interpreting California law, as I am not a California lawyer. I know my limits, and despite agreeing that Jobst's allegation of charity fraud is plausible here, I still have strong feelings about his sloppy research. As such, I'm going to further distinguish this finding of plausible by stating that Jobst's initial statement in his first video, that that Gerard's behavior was almost certainly illegal is trouble. This is not how justice works. You don't find the label to fit the deed and then gather evidence after the fact. You can't start with, it's definitely charity fraud, and then go hunting for evidence. Because if you go hunting for witches, you will inevitably find them. The initial evidence presented in Jobs' first video is not nearly enough for him to draw a conclusion of illegal behavior with certainty, and it does come across a bit like a witch hunt and not a proper investigation. And this brings us to allegation number 2, that the completionist stole money. You'll note that our definition of charity fraud doesn't necessarily implicate any taking of money from the charity to use for one's self. And so it is very important for us to distinguish the difference between charity fraud and embezzlement. The allegation that Gerard lied about what Open-Hand is doing and has done is charity fraud. And even if Gerard is charged with charity fraud, it is ultimately a simple misdemeanor. It's like shoplifting. The allegation that Gerard stole money from Open-Hand is potentially far more serious. If the value of these stolen funds exceeds $950, which it would, then this charge of embezzlement is no mere misdemeanor. It is a felony under California law, with a fine up to $10,000 and a term of up to 3 years in state prison. Jobs states in his final response that he doesn't even know how embezzlement got brought into the allegations, which worries me, as he's been alleging embezzlement the whole time. Wodahar even used the term embezzlement in one of his early videos on the topic, potentially even the first video if I recall correctly. And so it is no mystery how or why Gerard's response discusses embezzlement. The sloppiness of the legal research really comes through here when we discuss Jobs' argument surrounding embezzlement. In Jobs' final video, he pulls this definition of embezzlement from Google. How do I know that? Well, I typed definition of embezzlement into Google, and this automatic generation popped up right at the top. Look, for a non-legal definition, this is fine, but this is a legal accusation, and this is not a legal definition, and there is a very big difference. This Oxford Languages definition has no context. A legal definition is greater than the sum of its words. What also matters is how courts have treated language. Jobs' definition of embezzlement is theft or misappropriation of funds placed in one's trust or belonging to one's employer. California's definition is CPC Section 503. Embezzlement is the fraudulent appropriation of property by a person to whom it has been entrusted. See the spelling of entrusted there with the I? It's written like that because the law was enacted in 1872, and as such, it has a century and a half of precedents built on top of it, which affects its definition. The best way we have of approximating the actual definition of embezzlement is better summed up through the Judicial Council of California Criminal Jury Instructions, which states that to prove a defendant is guilty of embezzlement, one must prove that: Number 1, an owner entrusted his or her property to the defendant. Number 2, the owner did so because he or she trusted the defendant. Number 3, the defendant fraudulently converted that property for his or her own benefit. And number 4, when the defendant used the property, he or she intended to deprive the owner of its use. Remember our discussion of mens rea earlier? Well, this definition is fundamentally different from Jobs' definition because it adds the qualifier of intention to the calculus. So here's what we have to prove to show that embezzlement occurred. We can all acknowledge that donors gave money to Gerard/Open-Hand and that donors trusted Gerard/Open-Hand with that. However, we must also show that Gerard fraudulently converted the donated funds for his own benefit, and that when he used that property, he intended to deprive the donors of its use. Can we prove any of that? Well, let's find out. Jobs argues that Gerard is admitting to embezzlement when Gerard says that the money donated during Indieland is going to charity, and that he, meaning Gerard, wasn't touching any of it. Gerard says this very frequently, when in fact, according to Jobs, the money is not going to charity, as it is just sitting there, and some of that money is being used on expenses. But Gerard suggests that he has had to personally cover expenses for Indieland in the past. So, since Gerard says all money goes to charity, that he hasn't touched any of the donations, and that Indieland expenses have at times been covered out of pocket, when the tax returns show that Open-Hand has spent money on expenses, Gerard is lying, and thus his actions constitute, and I quote, admitting to embezzlement. Or or as stated elsewhere in Jobs' final video, that this is textbook charity fraud and is the literal definition of embezzlement.
This is again textbook charity fraud and is the literal definition of embezzlement.
Except, no it isn't. Your definition of charity fraud isn't from a textbook, it's from attorney-client Tinder. And your literal definition of embezzlement is literally not the right definition of embezzlement. The tax returns seem to show that no money has been taken out of the donated sum of $600,000. None of the charity's officers appear to have received any payment from this principal. The numbers might be inaccurate due to clerical error, but that alone is mere negligence at worst. It's not intentional. And even if it was intentional, there is no convincing evidence whatsoever that Gerard has converted the donated money for his own personal use. We'll get in a little bit to the claims that the funds are being hidden from the tax returns. If we look just at Gerard's statements, this time weighed uncharitably, believing all his statements are deliberate falsehoods engineered to attract donations, then at worst we end up with charity fraud, but not embezzlement. We are still missing an intention to convert the money for personal gain, not just an implication, not just an negligence, but actual intention is necessary. If we look at Gerard's statements charitably, however, which we really should because we believe that people are innocent until proven guilty, then really there's nothing legally wrong here. Gerard says that all the money goes to charity. He's not wrong. Open Hand is a public charity, remember that. He says that he doesn't touch any of it. That is true if weighed charitably. He receives no apparent payout, even if the charity disperses some of its donated income to use for expenses. And remember our 501c3 regulations. No part of the net earnings of which inures to the benefit of any private shareholder or individual. It is expected for a charity to use donated funds to pay for expenses. That is part of what charities do, and those expenses do not appear to be disbursements to any of Open Hand Foundation's officers. It could even be the case that Gerard has in fact donated his personal income to Open Hand to use on Indieland expenses. We don't know if that is the case, and neither does Jobs, which means that none of us are in a position to make allegations as serious as embezzlement. Jobs also brings up the Open Hand Foundation's recent donation of the accumulated $600,000 to the Association for Frontotemporal Degeneration, stating that the holding of the funds for the purpose of making a restricted donation makes no sense if now, all of a sudden, the foundation can in fact make such a donation, thus suggesting again some kind of malfeasance. But as we discussed earlier, it's perfectly normal for a public charity to hold onto funds, especially if a complicated endowment might be on the table. Well, let me ask all of you, why do you suspect the Open Hand Foundation suddenly had to donate $600,000 instead of waiting to build a substantial endowment fund? What could have possibly forced their hand? I can venture a guess. An uneducated allegation of serious criminal conduct pursuant to research that is no deeper on the legal side than the first page of Google. This allegation of embezzlement is both trouble and implausible. If a defamation lawsuit does arise from this debacle, I suspect that this allegation of embezzlement will take front and center stage. Okay, but what about allegation number 3? Don't these also play into allegation number 2, which is potential embezzlement? Why, if there is any embezzlement going on, this would be here, right? What about the golf tournament or Jamie Lee Curtis for the Twitch bits and stuff? All of that money isn't adding up, right? Look at the numbers. There's all this cash missing that should be included in the tax returns. If it isn't there, it must be somewhere, and the somewhere it is with Gerard and his family in their pockets. Now, let me ask you this, American taxpayers. If you mess up and underreport on your taxes, what happens to you? You pay the difference and a penalty, and that's a fairly normal occurrence because American tax law is a 70,000-page bureaucratic hellscape. Bad tax reporting isn't even remotely enough proof to show embezzlement. Now, do I agree that the golf tournament in particular is a little bit suspicious? Yes, it is a little suspicious. I could even believe that some cash has been unlawfully skimmed off the top of that event. But the evidence provided, the numbers, the showing of the sponsors, none of that is adequate evidence because we don't know what anyone actually paid or when they paid it. And what we don't know, we can't just assume. Gerard says that there was some inaccuracy in the tax reporting, and I'm inclined to believe him because that's very common, and doubly so for organizations like 501c3s. And remember, right? Innocent until proven guilty. Benefit of the doubt goes to the accused. Gerard could probably resolve this numbers game by submitting to something like a third-party audit and showing the results. But even that's not necessary, as the IRS is absolutely going to audit OpenHand after this debacle, and we will all have a chance to see for ourselves what the final numbers look like, and if there really is any malfeasance occurring. However, even in consideration of all of the above, there is another aspect about all of this tax return analysis that must be pointed out. Why did Gerard specifically bring up Jobst and Mudahar's mistake concerning the absence of a signature-only tax returns? Jobst makes a big deal about this and presents it as if it is just some kind of a gotcha statement. But it wasn't meant to be a gotcha. It's meant to show a very fundamental truth about these accusations. Jobst and Mudahar have a less than zero level of requisite legal understanding, a degree of legal knowledge so unqualified that the accusers don't even know about e-filing signatures on tax returns. We have here an Australian and a Canadian who aren't able to recognize even the most fundamental aspect of American tax returns, performing a tax audit on a 501c3 charitable organization pursuant to circumstantial evidence, hearsay, and legal research limited to Googling charity fraud and embezzlement and copy-pasting the first thing that popped up. I wonder if this is what H-Bomber guy feels like. But I digress. The point is, we don't have enough information to conclude that funds are missing, and certainly not enough information to conclude that any missing funds here have been stolen and embezzled. The circumstantial evidence does seem to suggest that missing funds are possible, but it's not at all certain. As such, I am calling allegation number 3, the missing funds, plausible, but also likely inconsequential. There's a philosophical saying, a razor, that I rely upon in my practice as a lawyer, but also in my day-to-day life as a human being. A way of thinking that reduces conflict, minimizes drama, and is generally accurate. It's called a Hanlon's razor, and it goes something like this. Never attribute to malice that which is adequately explained by stupidity. Ignorance is something we all occasionally fall victim to. The Jobsts, the Gerards, and the Moonies, for that matter, alike. And frankly, given what I've seen emerge from the completionist debacle, I'm inclined to give Gerard the benefit of the doubt. The court of public opinion is no place to try this case. Maybe I've missed something important, and if I have, please bring it to my attention in the comments. I'll try and address it there or gather enough questions for a follow-up mini-episode in response. Let me make something clear, though, before we wrap up this video. I might make content, but I'm YouTube. Prior to this matter being brought to my attention, as I had stated before, I never watched a single video by Carl Jobst or the Completionist or some ordinary gamers. This script and its notes total over 16,000 words, around 32 single-spaced pages, because not for watching the videos, but before thinking in depth about their content,
Gladiator.
I was initially quite convinced by Carl Jobst. Gerard isn't always the best communicator, and he has a tendency to speak before thinking, I've noticed. When Gerard is being interviewed by Jobst and he asks if Jobst wants money or something to put a stop to the investigation, is this Gerard offering a bribe? Or is this Gerard asking whether he's being extorted? It's hard to say, but it certainly looks ugly. I hate to see such serious accusations being levied, pursuant to such poor legal research. These accusations might be responsible for the termination of Indieland and the abandonment of a carefully organized endowment, which could cost the field of dementia research potentially millions of dollars in funding. There were a lot of numbers thrown around by Jobst and Mudahar, so let me provide some numbers of my own. Let me show you how the sausage is made. My most popular video to date has 900,000 views. It's made about $5,500. I can't disclose what I receive from sponsors due to contractual obligations, but what I can say is that in my experience, a sponsor pays around $20 to $30 per anticipated 1,000 views. And YouTubers like Jobst and Mudahar, who can frequently break that 1 million view barrier, will receive premium rates for their sponsorships. Jobst has produced 3 videos on The Completionist, 2 of which were sponsored. Mudahar has made 5 videos on this already? Though he hasn't solicited sponsors to my knowledge for those videos. But let's add the views on each video, average them out, and then lowball the figure. We'll say each video is worth $5,000. Let's lowball each sponsorship too, and say each one was worth not $20,000 or $30,000, but a mere $8,000. That's around $40,000 in YouTube income and $16,000 in sponsorships. However, low figure is about $56,000 made on the back of these accusations, roughly the annual median American male individual income. Let me ask you something, gentlemen. Let's say that open-hand tax returns and inevitable tax audit next year come back, and no charges of embezzlement or even fraud materialize. Or let's say that the state of California pursues an action against OpenHand and discovers at the end of it that they were innocent. I will be extra clear here because I know that there's a tendency to mince words and move goalposts. I don't mean mere punitive fines or even excise taxes. I mean specific governmental action and results against the OpenHand Foundation for the crimes of embezzlement and or fraud that you have specifically alleged. Can we expect you to apologize and donate your earnings and the sponsorship income from the relevant videos to dementia research charities? You might not want to answer that right away. Maybe talk to your own lawyers before you agree to anything. They might not want you making any confessions prior to a potential defamation action. And if such a defamation suit is filed, we'll cover that too in a future law review episode. I am just a tiny fish in an enormous YouTube ocean, but I'm proud to report that Moon Channel, despite only being monetized in February of 2023, has donated $4,255 to and raised an additional $1,261 in YouTube fundraising for Doctors Without Borders in 2023.
It's time to pull the trigger.
Contributions is burdensome and thankless, so I don't solicit funds. If the channel does a fundraiser, it goes through YouTube's systems straight to the charity. And I also donate 10% of Moon Channel's income to charity as well, with the money coming not from your pockets, but from my own. If you'd like to make a difference today, please consider checking out the fundraiser I've opened on this video supporting the Alzheimer's Association. I will be matching your donation out of pocket up to a maximum of $500, far more than this video is ever likely to make on YouTube. It's not much, but perhaps we can build something good from all of this trouble. I apologize as well for the lower quality of this video's editing. It's meant to be a law review episode and thus a shorter, quicker episode to make, but I got carried away with the script. You know how it is. I've been your host, Movie. Now thank you for tuning in to Moon Channel.
Oh, there is a dead human in our house.
Oh, hey, how did he get here?
Carl, what did you do?
Me? I didn't do this.
Explain what happened, Carl.
I've never seen him before in my life.
Why did you kill this person, Carl?
I do not kill people. That is my least favorite thing to do.
Tell me, Carl, exactly what you were doing before I got home.
All right, well, I was upstairs.
Okay.
I was sitting in my room.
Yes.
Reading a book.
Go on.
And, well, this guy walked in.
Okay.
So I went up to him.
Yes.
And I stabbed him 37 times in the chest.
Carl, that kills people.
Oh,
Carl.
wow, I didn't know that.
How could you not know that?
Yeah, I'm in the wrong here. I suck.
What happened to his hands?
What's that?
His hands. Why are they missing?
Well, I kind of cooked them up and ate them.
Carl.
Well, I was hungry, and, well, you know, when you crave hands, that's...
Why on earth would you do that?
I was hungry for hands. Give me a break.
Carl.
My stomach was making the rumblies
Carl.
that only hands would satisfy.
What is wrong with you, Carl?
Well, I kill people and I eat hands. That's two things. Over the past few
few years, I've been having my wife, more commonly known as the lady I live with, try out a bunch of different video games in order to examine how someone with little to no gaming experience engages with them. These informal experiments have given me a better understanding of some of the barriers that exist for inexperienced players and the opportunity to observe what the process of someone becoming proficient in the language of video games looks like. From these experiences, she's gone from someone who knew nothing about games to someone who knows some things about games, causing the name of this series to be less and less accurate with each additional entry. Oh well. Regardless, as the series has become more about her transition from a non-gamer to a gamer, I've been interested in having her play titles that share similarities with ones she tried early on in order to see how having more experience has changed her approach to playing them. So obviously, as soon as Tears of the Kingdom was announced, I knew I would have to run another informal experiment. Breath of the Wild was one of the earlier games she played for this series, and it was pretty much the first time where she actually felt successful while playing something. The freedom the game offers allowed her to solve problems and overcome obstacles in different ways, so even when she didn't pick up on what the game was nudging her to do, she was still able to find her own path. Where in other games she'd get frustrated when doing the thing that made the most sense to her wasn't possible, in Breath of the Wild, the vast majority of things she tried actually worked, rewarding her creative thinking and never making her feel stupid for not getting something. Tears of the Kingdom takes the base of Breath of the Wild and adds all sorts of new tools designed to increase player expression. And while I found this to be a welcome shift, I am curious as to how these additions will feel for an inexperienced player like my wife, as even though having more options increases flexibility, it also increases complexity, which may prove to be more annoying than helpful. So in order to find out, I had her play through the core of the tutorial, stopping once she got off the Great Sky Island, as I figured that'd be enough to give her a chance to engage with the majority of the primary mechanics and get a decent feel for how exploration works. Like always, I sat back as a mostly silent observer, only providing occasional reminders of things she had already learned and advice on what to do when she got stuck for a substantial amount of time. So this is how it went. Tears of the Kingdom gives control to the player quicker than any other 3D Zelda game, and this was something my wife appreciated, as she likes it when she doesn't have to spend a ton of time waiting before actually being able to start playing. This feeling was short-lived though, because the control the player is given at the start is pretty limited. Every few steps, Zelda would stop her to say something, and it got on her nerves quickly.
Am I gonna get stopped by her every time? Oh my god. Oh, really? She's gonna stop me again. Oh my god!
These interruptions seem to be a way to characterize Zelda as an excitable nerd while also providing some information about the lore of the world, but my wife found it to be far more annoying than endearing or informative. With games in the past, she's always found being stopped in this way to be jarring, as when she's playing a game, she really just wants to play the game, and losing control out of nowhere feels kind of bad. So it happening so many times in a row left a sour taste in her mouth. All
Your
that,
coming
things
was
did pick up a
foretold.
little as she came across a brief yet thrilling fight.
For the eternal
Followed by a
oasis!
fairly long cutscene that was followed by another fairly long cutscene, and she wasn't all that interested in any of it. In general, the intro is filled with a ton of exposition about the Zonai and the history of Hyrule, and while I found this to be intriguing because I'm invested in Zelda lore, for her it was just a massive info dump about a world
I
she
was
knew next to
invested, but
nothing
I
about.
knew I was
It
gonna
just
hate
didn't
this
mean much to her, and she ended up zoning out a bit. I've noticed this happen with cutscenes in other games she's played, but certainly not all of them. Really, her investment in a scene typically comes down to whether or not it is character focused. For instance, with The Last of Us, she was drawn in right away by Joel and Sarah's banter. The scene is about people connecting with each other, making it easy for her to care about what was going on in a way that hearing about a war that happened 10,000 years in the past never could. While there are certainly a few great moments in these early cinematic sequences in Tears of the Kingdom, they largely fail at being compelling scenes for a more general audience. What matters matters more, though, is that she went from thinking she'd get to start playing right away to sitting through 20 plus minutes of dialogue and cutscenes that she struggled to connect with, providing a decent bit of whiplash. And unfortunately, it would be a little longer until she got into the game proper, because upon arriving in the Room of Awakening and grabbing the Decayed Master Sword, she spent about 5 minutes searching every corner of the room for something to help her get out. To her, the Master Sword looked too blunted and brittle to be an effective weapon, and she assumed it would break before anything she might hit it with would. And in fairness, she wasn't that far off about that, but it did lead to her drawing the wrong conclusion. She overthought what was being asked of her, causing her to ignore the most obvious approach. After not finding anything, she eventually gave the Master Sword a shot, despite not thinking it would work. Throughout all of these experiments, I've noticed that my wife doesn't test things nearly as much as I do when playing a game. For her, if an action doesn't make sense, she rarely gives it a second thought. So when she got a sword that looked like it was about to fall apart, in her mind it stopped being a viable answer to the obstacle. As she's played more and more games, she's gotten better at interpreting the information presented to her, but it does still trip her up sometimes. And this was not the only instance of it happening during her playthrough of Tears of the Kingdom. The first and funniest, at least to me, happened at the very start, with her not knowing what button to press when the first text box showed up.
Can you help me? How do I follow the thing it's telling me? It's got a look down arrow!
Press A.
Why would that be the answer?
And this is pretty much exactly what happened when she played Breath of the Wild for the first time. What'd you hit to interact with?
A. Oh, it had a little like triangle facing down, so I was looking for that.
In fairness, it has been years since that first experience, so I'm not surprised it didn't stick with her. Also, the majority of the time, both games show button prompts for various actions, so having the arrow is visually inconsistent with how they present most other information. Another example came up during the Fuse Shrine, where she noticed the green coloring of the locked door, the green light on the front of the chest holding the key to it, and the green light of the Zonai charge in her inventory. Because of this, she thought they all must be connected, leading to a good chunk of time being spent on her trying to get something that would never work to work.
Are you kidding me right now? Are you kidding me right now? That didn't do it?
Ultimately, there will always be visuals that are misunderstood by players, even by ones who play games all the time. And while I do think developers should always consider the many ways the information they put out there may be interpreted, there is no way to control for how every player's brain will process information. That's why one of the best lessons an inexperienced player can learn is to just test everything, even if it doesn't make as much sense to them as the idea they originally started focusing on. Frankly, even I should do this more. Anyway, bringing it back to how things started, once she figured out that the Master Sword was useless, she made her way through the next bit easily enough, and after a brief freak out about how high up she was,
Seems like a death trap.
she made the leap into what I would say is the true start of the game. All things considered, it took her about 30 minutes to get to a spot where things actually opened up, and around 2/3 of that time was filled with text boxes and cutscenes. By comparison, it took her just 10 minutes to get to Breath of the Wild Center reveal and into the core of the tutorial, giving her the chance to immediately get a feel for the gameplay and what was expected of her. The frequent stops and starts of Tears of the Kingdom's opening sequence is a sharp contrast to this near immediate freedom, and it definitely left her feeling less engaged and a little frustrated. Having a hot start can go a long way for both experienced and inexperienced players. As games are an interactive medium, gameplay is the best way to connect someone to what's going on, so the sooner the player can get to that, the better, especially when they have no connection to the source material. It's also tough when a title relies so heavily on cinematics, despite them not being an important part of what the game is trying to do. Tears of the Kingdom's slower intro set up a rocky start for her, and while things did get smoother once she made it into the game proper, the design of the Great Sky Island proved to be a challenge for her in ways that the Great Plateau of Breath of the Wild did not. To games that center around player freedom, there generally are a ton of mechanics and ideas to figure out, and finding the best way to introduce those elements without getting in the way of the player's freedom is a tough challenge for developers. players. It's almost impossible to get perfect, and Tears of the Kingdom is no exception. The major mechanics are largely presented in one of three ways, by either pausing the action to show a text box of how something works, having a small informational prompt pop up in the top right corner of the screen, or being told how to do something by an NPC. I've talked a bit in the past about some issues with the first two approaches, primarily that pausing runs the risk of annoying the player, and that small text in the corner of the screen can be easily missed. Games that do these things would probably be better off finding some sort of middle ground between the two, that doesn't completely stop the action, but does put information front and center. While my wife didn't love either of those two approaches in Tears of the Kingdom, the third one is what ended up having a far more consequential effect on her playthrough. The Great Sky Island is filled with constructs, and many provide useful information about anything from combat to cooking. It's a cool way to incorporate tutorials somewhat organically, but it doesn't come without issues. The first being that the Great Sky Island is massive, and it's unlikely that players will comb every inch of it. Given that some of the constructs are pretty tucked away, it makes it very likely that the player will miss important information. What ended up being the biggest reason my wife didn't engage with the constructs, though, is that they are the primary enemy type on the island, and as she encountered a hostile one before a helpful one, she became wary of all of them. In general, she struggled with combat, and because she couldn't tell which kind of construct was which from a distance, it felt safer for her to just avoid them whenever possible. Eventually, though, she did get better at figuring out which ones were friendly. She noticed that intense music would play around the ones that attacked her, so as long as she didn't hear anything, she knew she was safe. By that point, though, she had already passed important information that would have been helpful to know. For instance, in order to get the Ascend ability, the player has to deal with the brutal cold of the snowy region, and the most efficient way to do that is by cooking a meal with spicy ingredients. There is a construct near the entryway of that area that tells this to the player, but doesn't actually explain how to cook. The ones that do are on a different part of the island, and she missed both of them, leaving her to figure it out on her own. Obviously, it's not the most complex thing in the world, and is something a lot of players will remember from Breath of the Wild, but as she had only done it once before years ago, she didn't know what the game wanted from her. She tried sitting by the fire to see if an option to cook would pop up, which frankly probably is how it should be done, but we do get why Nintendo likes it to be a more manual thing. I ended up having to nudge her in the right direction, and she mostly was confused as to why the construct by the fire didn't just tell her how it worked. Nintendo's effort to have these mechanics be taught in a natural way, it makes it possible for them to not be taught at all. In fairness, Tears of the Kingdom does have a wild amount of mechanics. It's why there's so much player freedom, and it can be hard to communicate all that information without overwhelming the player. And which is the reason some aspects are presented as plainly as others, is so that the player doesn't get bombarded with too many concepts. Now, having cooking fall into that category doesn't make much sense to me, but the general approach does. With that said, even with there being fewer mandatory tutorials than there could have been, my wife still got overwhelmed quickly from the sheer amount of inputs she needed to learn.
There's too many words for this. I'm never gonna focus. I won't.
Due to all the things Link can do in Tears of the Kingdom, the controller is pretty much used up to its limit. There aren't really any wasted buttons, and on top of that, there are also a bunch of additional inputs based on what ability you're using, where you're standing, or if you're in the air. Honestly, keeping track of
This
controls
realm
is
is-
something I had troubles with. Even after a dozen hours of playing, I still would press the wrong thing when trying to switch abilities. So it's no surprise that being inundated with all this information would be even more stressful for a less experienced player. As new mechanics were introduced to her, instead of integrating them into her approach, she mostly just relied more on the ones she felt comfortable and familiar with. So that largely boiled down to doing the stuff she remembered from Breath of the Wild, and by that I mean climbing. And it did serve her well for a while, but unfortunately, climbing wouldn't get her out of every situation.
This doesn't make it. Oh god, okay. How do I get up there then? How do I do it? How do I do it? Can you help me? I don't have a lot of time. Oh wait. How might I be able to do this? It's a great question.
Of the mechanics exclusive to Tears of the Kingdom, she was most drawn to Ultra Hand, which I imagine is fairly common. It is wildly versatile, and many obstacles across the world are designed with it in mind. In fact, when watching her play, it became clear just how much of the tutorial is centered around teaching the ins and outs of Ultra Hand. As it has so many elements to it, showing the different use cases to players has a ton of value, and will make their transition into the game proper much smoother. However, this ends ends up having a significant impact on the design of the Great Sky Island, in that in order to properly teach the wider scope of the mechanic, the player is heavily guided down a certain path. After reaching the Temple of Time, which is the first objective, they are pointed directly at the Ultra Hand Shrine that is conveniently located right next to it. Once that is completed, the player is encouraged to mark the other two shrines, the Ascend Shrine, which is up in the mountains and super far away, and the Fuse Shrine, which is somewhat close and the trek looks simple enough, making it more likely to go that way. Also, there are paths on both sides of the Ultra Hand Shrine that lead toward the Fuse Shrine, increasing the odds even further that players will head to it. This is the path my wife took, it's the path I took, and it's the path most people I know who've played the game took. Most importantly, it is the path Nintendo clearly wants the player to take, and they aren't subtle about it. This is a pretty big departure from the structure of Breath of the Wild's tutorial, because once the player starts down the path, they kind of get locked into a linear progression around the Great Sky Island. There are massive gaps between its different sections, so players can't really change course unless they complete
If you
the
ever
backtrack.
haven't-
Comparatively, while Breath of the Wild also has an intended route, it feels far more like a suggestion, as given the layout of the Great Plateau, players can easily head to any shrine they want to at any point. They never really get locked into just one path. This is something my wife really liked, as it allowed for a more fluid approach to the various challenges she encountered. When she came across an obstacle that seemed too much for her, she'd just go somewhere else and take on a challenge she felt more ready for. With Tears of the Kingdom, though, she ran into various spots that acted almost like choke points, where she had to engage with an obstacle in a specific way in order to progress. These bottlenecks act as a way to almost guarantee that the player will learn more about the complexities of the major abilities before being unleashed into the wider world. The goal is to provide more situational practice, and it makes sense from a game design standpoint, but it does go against the open design philosophy of Breath of the Wild's tutorial, and honestly of the rest of Tears of the Kingdom. This created a bit of friction for my wife, as she didn't feel like she was able to forge her own path, and instead had to troubleshoot specific challenges until she got it.
Gosh. Help me get Dash. Thanks.
On top of that, Great Sky Island being made up of a bunch of smaller islands that aren't always the easiest to traverse didn't help her either. Going the wrong way felt way more consequential, because getting back on track was rarely as simple as walking back to where she last was like she could in Breath of the Wild. Instead, it became a new obstacle to overcome, in her eyes mostly serving as a way to eat up a bunch of time just to get back to square one. Of course, these diversions did get her to better understand stamina management and the range of Ultra Hand, but she didn't find it satisfying to put in so much effort without any notable sense of progression. Most side paths ended up feeling like dead ends to her, and frankly, a lot of them are. They may give an item or bypass a small part of the main path, but ultimately they are just detours. To be clear, Tears of the Kingdom's tutorial does have a kind of navigational freedom. It's unlikely that two players will walk the exact same path within the intended route, and even the bottlenecks can be done without engaging with whatever it is trying to get the player to engage with. It is also possible to complete the shrines in any order, although doing the Fuse Shrine first involves running directly past one of the other two, so it's unlikely someone would do this for any reason other than to get footage for a YouTube video where they mention it can be done. Despite all that, the navigational freedom given to players in the tutorial is still limited, which made it harder for her to play how she wanted to. Where in Breath of the Wild's tutorial, freedom is used to give players choices, in Tears of the Kingdom, freedom seems to be there so players feel like they have choices, even though the game is doing everything it can to funnel them down one path. While this certainly wasn't the biggest issue for her, she did get hung up on obstacles in a way she didn't really in Breath of the Wild. Interestingly enough, had she gone the other way around the island, it would have been a far easier time, as it mostly involves climbing up and then down. It doesn't require solving any Ultra Hand puzzles, and is pretty much just a straight shot from one shrine to the next. Even a lot of that can be skipped by going to the slope near the Ascend Shrine and using a plane to glide over to the Fuse Shrine, although I don't think my wife would have thought to do that, and even if she had, she didn't have the best track record with controlling the planes.
What's happening? What's happening? What's happening? Oh! Dive R. I don't know if there's water beneath me. Oh!
All in all, even though that path would have been simpler, I think it's for the best that she didn't take it, as gaining a better understanding of the mechanics is more important than getting through things with no resistance. Going the unintended way means missing out on learning the intricacies of a bunch of mechanics, and it's a bit surprising to me that it's an option at all because of how ineffective of a tutorial it ends up being. With that said, it could be argued that this path teaches the most valuable lesson of Tears of the Kingdom, which is that there are many ways to break the intended experience, and the player should never be afraid to do it. While my wife didn't learn that lesson in this way, it is one she came around to in her own time. Even though the main abilities in Tears of the Kingdom are more mechanically complex than the ones in Breath of the Wild and therefore harder to learn, my wife ended up liking them all way more, especially, as I mentioned before, Ultra Hand. This is not surprising, as the games she's enjoyed the most throughout these experiments typically include building in some capacity. In general, she finds it fun to create stuff, and it also gives her a sense of control that makes it easier for her to feel invested. When she can manipulate items or even the environment itself, it gives her more opportunities to do things in a way that makes sense to her, instead of having to fully conform to what a game wants her to do. This type of sandbox approach allows her real-world logic to be more effective within the game space. Of course, the actual process of using Ultra Hand did take her a while to get used to. Getting objects rotated in the direction she wanted involved a lot of trial and error, and due to all the conditional controls, she'd sometimes mistake what mode she was in and move things in ways she didn't mean to. In turn, this sometimes led to her attaching things in suboptimal ways, and she often found herself wishing that the game just knew what she wanted to do.
Kidding me? Do it perfectly?
Well, it doesn't know how you want it.
Well, it should.
Why?
It's so obvious. Don't you write about me
No,
like that.
Ash, really hard to learn.
Don't you dare.
While a change like this would make the building in Tears of the Kingdom less versatile and interesting, given that most of the things she constructed were relatively straightforward, I do understand her desire for it to autocorrect to a position that actually makes sense. It being so particular with how attaching objects together works led to her spending a lot of time trying to get things just right, and as in her everyday life she's a bit of a perfectionist, she always wanted things to be aligned as perfectly as possible, which added even more time. All of this did give her a ton of practice though, and she started to get a pretty good grasp over how it worked, and due to it being a mechanic she enjoyed, she didn't know it took to figure it out. The other ability she had a decent bit of use out of was Ascend. She liked being able to get to the top of things quickly, especially as she was prone to falling off stuff. As for the other two, she
What the hell was that?
only ever using them when it was mandatory. In fact, she actually skipped past a few puzzles that I thought required them. The first happened in the Fuse Shrine with the puzzle I mentioned before, where she hyper-focused on the green of the chest matching the green of the concert core instead of looking at the wood plank and leaves surrounding the chest. By the time she started to search for a different solution, the fire fruit she had picked up earlier were a distant memory, so instead of using Fuse, she found a torch, placed an arrow in it, and shot it up there.
That's not what I thought was gonna happen though.
Her goal was to burn the chest, but even though the plan was off by a bit, it still worked, which is all that matters. The next major instance was just before the Forest Shrine. To get to it, the player has to fast travel to the starting room and then use recall to traverse these gears. But when she got to the room, she ran right past them towards the waypoint on her minimap. At first, she looked around to see if there was a way to climb up, but then remembered that she could use Ascend, which got her right into the room. That's interesting. The last notable instance happened in the fourth shrine itself. It ends with a puzzle where the player has to use recall to align the hands of the clock in order to open the door, but instead she used Ultra Hand to get them aligned and then attach them together.
Wow! Awesome! Good!
All of these were really awesome to see because they aren't how I did them or would have thought to do them. With all three instances, it seems pretty clear that Nintendo designed them with these approaches in mind. While the devs definitely heavily guide the player throughout the tutorial, their goal still is to get them to be as creative as possible with the tools they have, and creating challenges that can be solved through the use of different abilities is one way to get players to do that, and it certainly worked for my wife. It just took years to learn the ins and outs of the major mechanics. Even though it took longer to get there, she was eventually able to have a similar sense of freedom with Tears of the Kingdom that she had had with Breath of the Wild. I'd even argue that in some ways it was a more meaningful form of freedom, as most of the freedom she felt in Breath of the Wild came from being able to find her own path to a destination, which had more to do with the world layout and ability to climb almost anything than having a solid understanding of the core mechanics. Here though, the freedom came through clever uses of the core abilities. She was able to apply what she had learned earlier in order to progress, even when it was not the intended or optimal approach, and this made her feel good at the game in a way that not even Breath of the Wild did.
This is, oh my. Oh no, oh my, oh. Oh,
All things said and done, Tears of the Kingdom proved to be a much more challenging game for her than its predecessor. For the majority of the time, she felt limited with how she could approach each obstacle and confused by the complexity of the various abilities. But by the end, it did successfully get her to a place where she understood the mechanics well enough to use them in a way that made the most sense to her. And that's the beauty of Tears of the Kingdom's approach to game design. It gives players the tools to do things in a way that makes the most sense to them. There are almost always multiple solutions to a problem, and I'm sure Nintendo planned for many of them, but the mechanics are so versatile that players have found ways to do things that Nintendo could have never fully anticipated. Now, I don't think every game should do this. I love when a title pushes me to think in the way it wants me to, but it is incredibly liberating to play a game that gives players this much agency, and I think titles that do this are especially valuable for less experienced players. Not having to conform to a single approach lowers the barrier of entry. The hard part is getting those players to a point where they have a grasp over the many things there are to learn. And I don't think Tears of the Kingdom fully nails it with how it onboards newcomers. In some instances, it leaves far too much up to chance, and in others, it directs the player in a way that almost feels at odds with the game's ethos. With that said, it did do just enough to prepare my wife to engage with it in the way it was meant to be engaged with, by learning to break the quote-unquote rules. Tears of the Kingdom is far too massive and combat-focused for my wife to be interested in playing a whole lot more of it. The mechanical freedom it offered did help build her confidence as a player. She gained an understanding of the game that felt unique to her. Like Breath of the Wild, it met her in the middle in a way most games haven't. And I think titles that do this are some of the best for turning non-gamers to gamers.
Proud of me?
Yeah, it's very good.
That was really good.
You're very good.
That was extra good. Do you want another thing?
As my wife has now played through the first hour or so of a bunch of different games, I figured it was about time to check in with her to see which ones she's actually enjoyed playing. So I had her make a list of her favorites for us to go over, and you can watch us talking about them right now on Nebula. For those of you who don't know, Nebula is a creator-owned streaming service that I've been a part of for 3 years now, and over there you can watch everything I post on YouTube ad-free, as well as a ton of exclusive videos. This past year alone, I made a video essay diving into the ending of BioShock Infinite, did a ranking of modern Soulsborne games, turned a script I wrote 10 years ago into an unfortunate video, and a bunch of other stuff. Nebula gives me a place to experiment with content, like interviewing my wife about what games she likes to play, and it's also one of the best ways to support me as a creator, because when you sign up for Nebula using my link in the description, I get a chunk of that money for as long as you're subscribed. By signing up, you can get access to everything on Nebula, which ranges from original series to podcasts to classes to anything else that some of the best creators on the platform are interested in making, like Patrick H. Willems' Star Wars Holiday Special. Also, Nebula is currently offering lifetime plans, so for a one-time payment you can get access to the service for as long as you and Nebula are both on this earth. If you're not looking to make a big purchase though, you can still get Nebula for $2.50 a month for a year over at nebula.tv/Rasputin. Regardless of the plan you choose, Nebula is one of the best places on the internet for high-quality entertainment, and it is a great deal. So yeah, give it a look, help support me, and watch my wife talk about how she likes Fortnite. Anyway, thanks to Nebula for sponsoring this video. We're all in.
Creator of JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, Hirohiko Araki has many practices and techniques he's developed over time that allow him to create manga as culturally impactful and lively as JoJo. But one of, if not his most important practice, is on-site research, physically going to the places he depicts in his drawings to bring the story, characters, and setting as close to reality as possible, traveling all around the world throughout the years to Egypt, Italy, the American Southwest, and parts 4 and 8 are based on Araki's hometown of Sendai, Japan. So now, in part 9, the JoJo lands with such a rich and vibrant setting as Hawaii that Araki has been depicting in incredible detail. It seemed pretty certain that he had traveled in preparation for part 9, and in the latest issue of JoJo magazine, we got a whole article that details Araki's visit to Hawaii, showing the places he went and some insight into how he goes about conducting research, which I'll be covering in today's video. So the article is titled Araki's Interview Techniques and is a collection of testimonies from the editors who accompanied him on the trip, describing their activities and sometimes quoting Araki directly. The team together conducted research on Oahu and the main island, which is where the story takes place, starting out on Oahu where we saw Jojo's school, South Gate Street, the junkyard, and in the magazine photos we can see the overpass which was depicted in chapter 1. So before Araki and his team actually went to Hawaii, they said he had already determined the direction of the main character Jojo since the end of JoJolian's serialization. But what he learned in Hawaii and from the people who live there, they really helped shape the character. Hearing directly from the locals about their life experiences, their day-to-day lives, and observing people's behavior closely really enriched the image of the character, emphasizing the importance of observing your surroundings and not simply watching, picking up on even the smallest details like the way people move and the clothes they wear. The editors say it's Araki's constant presence that fleshes out the characters and story, making it more realistic, referencing an experience they shared at a car rental shop on the main island, which Araki had put into the story in chapter 2, where in real life and in the manga they had rented a Camaro. They said that basically all of the photography was taken by Araki himself, who always had his camera by his side, saying he wanted to see what kind of plants are growing there, spending a long time at the botanical gardens capturing many different plants on camera. And this research, of course, was well worth it, especially within the recent arc Cat's Eyes, as when you look at the environment and the variety in the plants, you get the feeling that these characters exist in a real place. So like Araki's writing, his research is also fueled by curiosity, as even when driving down a seemingly featureless road, they said Araki would suggest to stop the car and take a walk, taking pictures of the road, what's around them, and the lava that had cooled and solidified. And this road where Araki had stopped to take some photos looks to be the same drive taken by the characters on their way to Rohan's villa. They say even sounds and smells would guide them to new discoveries, saying once they entered a certain town, a strong smell of chicken wafted in the air, prompting Araki to go off the beaten path and follow the smell to some local food vendors cooking food out of a repurposed trailer. And this is what Araki means when he says you can't find everything online or in books. There are certain aspects of being places physically that give you a greater understanding of the setting, and will lead you places you never would have found otherwise, and even inspire new ideas for the work. They say Araki would often venture off the guided path, trying to see more than just tourist attractions, but rather immerse himself in the lifestyle of the locals and to get a feel for what it's actually like to live there, asking questions about their culture and people's routines. One of Araki's most fascinating discoveries in Hawaii was their land formations. They say Araki listened intently to the tour guide's explanations, but also asked a lot of questions about the land, how it came to be, its history, how people live there, and what kind of people come to visit, expressing a great interest in the cooled lava found around the island and how it formed, which is most likely the inspiration behind the concept of mechanisms within the story, and the focus on a lava rock being this supernatural object with a mysterious power that's the driving force of the plot. And the last page of the article is titled Work While Having Fun, which talks about how although Araki was there for research, he was enjoying himself every step of the way, and the work even gave him energy, saying they were surprised by Araki's seemingly limitless physical strength. And even in the heat he remained active, waking up early in the morning, going for a swim in the pool, and conducting interviews until the evening, while also taking walks in his short free time. So as predicted, Rohan's role at the JoJo Lands, a mangaka conducting research in Hawaii, was absolutely a self-insert for Araki, drawing ideas from his own experiences, like his daily swims and interest in the lava rocks. As they said, every location the cast has spent time in so far was a part of their research. So just as a fan of JoJo and Araki, it's really really wholesome seeing him happy and healthy, traveling, doing what he loves, as it's always Araki's passion and curiosity which results in the best stories possible, and the quality of Part 9 definitely reflects his passion. So I can't wait to see where he takes his moving forward in the JoJo lens. So that's going to be all for today, guys. Just a quick video to close out the year. Thank you all so much for watching. Like if you enjoyed, subscribe for more, and look forward to more content in 2024. Talk to you all real soon, but until then, I'm out. Peace.
What is it? Hey, Favonius. Well, damn it.
Quietly now. Gotcha. Chop. Ha. Take flight. Yeah. Game's up. Fun's over. Hard-hitting exclusive. Hold that pose. Please hold for just a moment. Embrace the ice. Water jet! We have to end this. I have dishonored. Smile! Power flows through me! Quietly now. Here comes the catch. Truth bomb! Wipe out! Out of my sight! Busted. Quietly now. No! Things are about to get dicey. Sakura swirl! Say cheese! Winter shall eventually come.
This team fucking sucks.
A blade embraces its duty, as a jeweler cherishes their gems.
This video is supposed to be about the abyss. I'm gonna play for time of this gameplay on
Nice and spicy! Busted! Let my name echo in song! Here comes the catch. Quietly now. I must leave no stone unturned. as a good knight should. Shower me with busted. Nice and spicy. Yoo-hoo! Let the world collide!
Game's up. Fun's over. Quietly now. Busted.
Leave it all to me. Time to clean up.
Okay. Bye-bye.
I'll catch up. I'll catch up. Out of the frying pan, into the fire.
Yep.
Time to shine.
Here comes the catch.
Steady as stone, as a good knight should.
Gotcha. Quietly now. Busted.
Nice and spicy.
Yep.
Yeah. Let my name echo in song.
Game's up. Fun's over. Quietly now.
Leave it all to me, as a dutiful maid would. I'll catch up. Eat this! Bubba, get them! Time to clean up. Time to shine.
Here comes the catch. Gotcha. Busted.
You'll find life is city fire. Fire and fire.